Hi, this is Chris Howard, host of Plugged In with Chris Howard, and I'm taking the Lions over the Chiefs in the Super Bowl. BetOnline has free odds and lines available online or on your mobile device. Visit BetOnline today.
Welcome, one and all, to the Media Roundtable Industry Edition, where we deep dive into events and topics around the business of audio through the lens of the brands and buyers who support it, or as we call them, Chief Audio Officers. I'm your host, Spencer Semonson, media buyer and all-around menace here at Oxford Road. We are back yet again to break down this week's top stories in the industry. To help me, please welcome our good friend, James Cridland, editor of Podcast Business Journal and Podnews.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Appreciate it. To round out our panel, we have some Oxford Road agents of influence, Stew Redwine, VP of Creative Services.
So happy to be here, Spencer, with you at the helm.
Appreciate that as well. Neal Lucey, EVP Strategy and Product.
Happy to be here for your first ever hosting gig.
And it's going amazing, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And last but certainly not least, Julia Palmero, media buyer and planner extraordinaire.
It's an honor to join the menace, Spencer Semonson, here today.
They're going to change that on my LinkedIn very shortly. I don't have a choice in the matter. Let's start with industry news from Podcast Business Journal. James, what stories do you have that will inform and entice our chief audio officers?
Well, I don't know about informing and enticing, but there's two big stories, I think, this week. One of them, YouTube rolling out podcasting. RSS ingestion is being rolled out this week. They're doing webinars to podcast companies as well, which is all very exciting. I think that they've definitely got the opportunity to change up this space. The one thing for chief audio officers to know is that they do not allow adverts in those podcasts. So if you're wanting to buy advertising through YouTube, then you have to buy it with YouTube and not through anybody else, which is going to be interesting, I think. We've also had Todd Cochran from Blueberry on the Podcast Business Journal last week. He was celebrating 19 years of podcasting, and he called media buyers lazy for focusing on the big shows and not the small ones. So always good to hear from Todd, even if he is calling us all lazy.
I don't know if Todd has met Spencer and Julia yet.
Quite possibly not.
Quick question for you on the YouTube story. So YouTube will be owning the podcast inventory, but for simulcasts, for people that are posting their podcasts on YouTube where they have the host read ads, well, I assume that will continue, but let me know if I'm wrong.
Well, that will continue, but they have said that they do not accept podcasts with ads in them. So sponsorship is fine. If I'm there saying this podcast is brought to you with Oxford Road, then that's absolutely fine. But when it comes to a 30-second ad that might get ingested via, DAI or something like that, then YouTube have said they do not accept those. And that's something which is very clear in the specs, but I don't think that anybody has really clocked that yet. The fact that if you're running a podcast with DAI in there, if you're running a podcast with any form of pre-recorded advert in there, then YouTube has basically said that is against our terms, and we do not want that. So fun times, I think, over the next 3 or 4 weeks as we try and understand exactly what that means for us.
Do you have a prediction, James?
A prediction. It's difficult to know because YouTube is they're very good at chasing the flashing lights, aren't they? And this is big. We'll chase that. No, we'll close it down now because we've got bored with it. This is their 4th podcast app. But I have to say, YouTube Music is an app which is pre-installed on every single Android phone. So if you've got an Android phone, you will have YouTube Music on it if it's a new one. So I think that's a big deal. And YouTube is the 2nd largest search engine in the world. So, I mean, it's a great place to put your podcast. The question is, can we actually earn money out of podcasting with some of the YouTube rules? And of course, I guess if you have enough people listening to your podcast, then YouTube will give you some of their money. So I suppose there is that sort of side of it as well. But it's, yeah, I think it's just going to be fascinating watching, but probably way too early to actually guess what's going to happen there.
Thank you for giving some vindication to Android users by noting that the importance of that. We need it more and more every day. With our first story today, we have some info gleaned from across the pond. So I'm going to go to Neal with a new story. What do you have for us, Neal?
So there's new YouGov research for the UK revealing that the majority of podcast listeners are not receptive to advertising, with 42% skipping the ads. And then some listeners find them intrusive, but still listen to them. And then there's 14 who don't have much interest in all of them. There's also some kind of back and forth with Acast, and Acast's own research showing that actually people do listen to podcast ads. So the hot take for us is, even though this is UK-based research, if we go by consumer behavior, and I think it's been proven pretty well time and again, if there's a way to avoid advertising, people will take the easy way and they will avoid advertising. So I guess my question for all of us on the panel, who skips through the podcast ads?
Who skips through? I skip through the pre-rolls. I skip through the pre-rolls for sure.
Julia?
Yeah, if there's stacked ads by the second or third, I'm fast forwarding for sure.
That's a very good thing to note, because if it's a couple of ads, I will listen for loyalty reasons because I want that host to get the money. But yes, if it's programmatic or stacked ads, I will probably skip all of them.
How about you, James? This is your business. You got to listen to the ads, don't you?
I do exactly the same as Stew does, and I skip the pre-rolls because the phone is still in my hand. I've just pressed the play button and the phone is still in my hand. And so therefore it's really easy for me to go, oh, it's starting with an ad, skip. Oh, there we go. Whereas, of course, when you're halfway through, if you're listening to a mid-roll, then you've got to get your phone out of your pocket or lean forward in the car and everything else. And so I think it's different. And I think maybe that's the thing around pre-rolls and mid-rolls and the pricing of those, is that actually, you know, you can probably charge more for the mid-rolls because you know that there's going to be more people who listen all the way through, perhaps.
I'd also be interested to see them take some data on where that people are listening, because if I'm listening on Spotify, similar to having the phone in my hand, it's a lot easier for me to fast forward, but I have YouTube Premium, and to pick up my phone and do fast forward that way is a lot more manual, and I'm more likely to listen through, even if they are a couple ads in a row, when I'm listening to a podcast as a simulcast rather than just the audio version.
Yeah, and it's
So-
funny, for the pre-rolls in the first, I was thinking about it, and it's like the pre-rolls in the first podcast in the queue. And then once it gets going, it turned, today I was listening and it turned over to I started listening to the Journal Sam Bankman-Fried deal. And, you know, it goes in with ads, and it's like, I'm along for the ride. Cause like you said, I have to exert some effort to alter that chain of events. But I did want to say, and you called out, Neal, that it was from the UK where this study is. I just think it's interesting that, you know, looking at the history of audio advertising, that there was like a 50-year gap between the first commercial advertisements on radio in the United States and then in the UK. Even though the BBC was formed, I think the same year that the first commercial aired on air here in the United States, it wasn't until much later. So to me, that's like to this, that's important. And then to like any study or any data, it's always so important to go like contextually, you know, is there more of a resistance in audio to advertisement where you have a half century where it's always been baked in the cake in the United States, in the United Kingdom? There's more resistance to a commercial message being in audio.
Well, as the Brit, I can tell you that, I mean, 50% of all radio in the UK still has no advertising on it at all. And so, you know, when you hear radio advertising, if you only listen to the BBC, and lots of people do, then when you hear audio advertising, you go, "Oh, what's this?" It's a very strange old thing. So I suspect that there's a fair amount of differences here. I mean, 20% of TV in the UK has no advertising on it whatsoever. So it's a very different world, as you so rightly point out, Stu, than the US or, indeed here in Australia, where advertising is far more part of the media landscape. In fact, it's commercial radio's 50th birthday this month in the UK. LBC and Capital Radio both limped on the air in 1973, in the middle of goodness knows how many economic crises and and everything else, and they're still with us now. So, but I think that's a real difference in between the US, Canada, Australia, where audio advertising has been with us for a long, long time. It's really not the case in the UK, and I think that it's difficult to look at studies like this without bearing that in mind. And also, frankly, we don't know what the question was that they asked, which is the other thing. And I'm always slightly nervous about generalists like YouGov asking very nuanced questions about podcasting when we don't necessarily know exactly how they asked that question, what they really mean by 42% skip the ads entirely. Do they skip all of the ads entirely, or do they skip some of the ads entirely, or do they skip some of the ads some of the time? We don't kind of really know. So I'm always a little bit dubious without seeing the actual research, and they've not published that.
No, fair enough. I think an important point for all of us is we have clients now that are expanding into international markets. And so the commercial audio landscape could be very different in terms of the history and the acceptance of commercial audio. So be it podcast, streaming, radio. So just something for us to be considerate of as we're expanding into new geographies.
That is a good note. And why don't we pivot into American public radio with a new bit of news from WNYC? Neal, what else do you have for us today?
Okay, I get the second one too. So WNYC, the largest NPR member station, is shifting its strategy from standalone podcasts to more of a broadcast to podcast, meaning we'll take our radio content and we will use it in podcast format. So more so that podcast is a channel to deliver broadcast content versus an original place to develop radio content. So the change was prompted by belief that radio still has massive reach, and it has a big reach advantage over podcasts. And so there's a lot of uncertainty facing the podcast division. So there were layoffs. It's not certain what their execution plan will be in terms of cancellation on some of the popular podcasts. My hot take for this is counter to trends in audio listenership. So we've obviously seen on-demand take over linear listening this year. Podcast consumption has doubled in the past 4 or 5 years. So WNYC has taken sort of the counter view and leaning into the radio's current advantage in terms of reach and time spent. So we'll see how the story ages. Maybe we might have to check back in 5 years or so to really know. But I think the other point is, a lot of people made investments into podcasts, and I think, as Dan said on Friday, got over their skis a little bit, right? So they made these huge investments, and those investments haven't really paid off in the near term, and they've had to change course. So, I mean, there are some economic realities that are at play here as well.
I think it's interesting that we keep talking about radio dying out, thinking that it'll be a bang. Because radio isn't going anywhere. Radio is still the powerhouse that we all assumed it would be 20 years ago. And the fact that we continually use podcasts as a distribution for other media that either is also audio or video in nature is decimating podcast listenership consistently, because it often gets folded into programmatic and round of network buys that are great for budget, but not for DR. So it's interesting that they yet again want to use it as a distribution hub. I would too also want to see where it's going to go in about 5 years when they figure out their long-term strategy. But for now, I think it's just them trying to make up for lost inventory.
I would jump in. I'm off next week talking at a radio conference in Munich, in Germany. Munich in October should be fun, shouldn't it? So, you know, the radio industry is really not going away, but I think there are changes. You know, I think, Neal, you're absolutely right in mentioning that on demand has overtaken live radio, live listening in the US this year. But that includes on-demand music. So it's not podcasting overtaking radio by any stretch of the imagination. It's all on-demand audio overtaking all live audio. And so I think from that point of view, there's still a long way to go. 58%, I think, of Americans don't listen to podcasts every month. That figure for radio is somewhere around 10%. So I think we've still got an awfully long way to go in terms of that. And that's great news for all of us in podcasting, because there's so much growth still to actually happen.
What do you think of the strategy of using podcasts as more of a distribution channel for radio content versus trying to create, original content?
I mean, I think WNYC, like any media company, is having a hard time of it. And I think partially it's because young folk like us keep on talking about, I just said young folk like us, I'm 52. Young folk like us keep on talking about radio dying, and some people believe it. And I think that's a concern for somebody like WNYC. I think from their point of view, they are very different to iHeartRadio, which is of course mostly full of music, mostly full of other people's content. WNYC is producing its own content, and one of the things that I talk about when I've got my radio consultant's hat on is making sure that the stuff that you are producing works on as many different platforms as possible. So it doesn't just work for live, it doesn't just work for on demand, it works for as many different things as you possibly can. And I think that's probably one of the things that WNYC needs to think about, is how does the content that they are making for the radio, how does that work in terms of podcasting, but also how does the content that they used to make or still do make, which is podcast exclusive, how can they get better value from that and use that on the radio? And that might be just airing the podcast on the radio at some point, but it might also be rethinking how they're making that particular show so that they can use segments of that in their in their podcasting, in their live radio broadcasting as well, and working out really what the changes to production are. You can always spot an industry, a podcast market, which is not particularly evolved when you see lots of reheated radio shows in the top 10. New Zealand is very much like that. Parts of Asia very much like that. And I think it's just, those don't always make for the best shows. And I think it's having a real think about what you do in terms of making audio so that it works on both podcasting and on live radio as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. Definitely a great point to consider, that things can live in different platforms and making sure that works in those different platforms.
All right, so tell me if you've ever heard of any of these companies. Indeed, Shopify, NetSuite, Headspace, Quip, Theragun, Postmates. I'm not only the host of the Media Roundtable, but also CEO of a company called Oxford Road, and we are the world's leading independently owned and operated audio ad agency. And what that means is that we help great companies, many that you have probably heard of on some of the other podcasts that you listen to, We help them test and scale campaigns in audio channels, with podcast being one of those leading channels. Some of the work that we do includes media planning and buying, as well as analytics, attribution, and insights. And we also have a very special way that we deal with creative and copy generation. We have our own proprietary process called Audiolytics that allows us to score ads for their persuasiveness. If you're looking to be involved in audio and you want a partner that can help work with you to make sure that you achieve unprecedented ROI and massive scale, you should get in touch with us at Oxford Road. And by the way, the only reason that we're able to do the work of the Media Roundtable is because we have a great team at Oxford Road that supports us and makes it possible. So, what we're doing is not just a podcast, but we're really trying to help brands live out their values and balance that with their business objectives, which is an increasingly hard thing to do in this world of misinformation and malice that's infecting so much of our media. But at Oxford Road, we don't want to just broker this stuff. We want to impact the industry for good. We want to raise the bar on what gets created. And Oxford Road is helping make that possible through the Media Roundtable. So if you're somebody that's interested in working with an ad agency or a partner on this type of work for your advertising campaigns, go to oxfordroad.com. It's easy to spell. And get in touch with us, or at least just sign up for our free newsletter, The Influencer. That's oxfordroad.com.
Absolutely. Can't agree more. Now, I know we've all been tricking and treating our way through the Halloween season, but Thanksgiving is on the horizon. So I'd like to turn to Stew with some tips and tricks for ad copy during the holidays. Stew, what do you have for us?
So our friends over at Baratonic put together a study of 300 plus different individuals in the U.S. who report listening to podcasts and streaming audio about their expectations during the holidays when it comes to what they're listening to. And the main thing to highlight, I mean, there's a lot of good stuff in here, but the first thing, 80% of the monthly listeners plan to travel during the holiday season, with 87% of them tuning into streaming audio or podcasts on the go. And 63% of the respondents say the majority of their holiday podcast and streaming audio listening is holiday themed episodes and playlists. What I thought was interesting related to the earlier conversation is 50% tend to listen to an entire audio ad, while 43% will just give the first few seconds a chance to catch their interest. So there's a lot right there that we could discuss. But the most interesting one to me, especially during this time of year and thinking of marketing messages during this time of the year we're coming into the holidays, 76% of U.S. respondents who regularly listen to podcasts and streaming audio expect hearing audio ads with discount codes. So there's a fully loaded expectation in the holidays that I'm going to get some sort of a deal, that it's going to be better than the regular deal. And that's just important to keep in mind as we're putting together those messages during this season. I think it's also important to keep in mind people are traveling. And so how could your message relate and be more contextual to them in that regard? And it's the holidays. People are, 63% of them are intentionally listening to holiday stuff. So if the ad has a holiday feel to it, even though that can be grating for some, it could be exactly the kind of thing to prime the audience to take action, especially when it's paired with a great deal over the holidays.
So do you think that including holiday themes in your advertising will work?
I do. Absolutely. Yes.
Even if it's cliche?
I didn't say that. No. I think there's a way to do it tastefully, and I think it needs to match what it is that you're advertising, but I wouldn't be afraid of some jingle bells. Okay? Don't be afraid of putting some jingle bells in the mix.
I mean, we talk about the tune-in value of copy, but really there is that low-hanging fruit for the holiday season. And I really don't hear it a lot except for like D2C brands. Do you think that there's probably some B2B or B2C that aren't taking advantage of this that definitely could make that jump in 2023?
Yes, for a couple of reasons. One, in general, B2B is bland to bland, right? So across the board, B2B is already bland. And so then if you're the B2B brand that actually made like a holiday song spot or really made it feel like the season, right there, you're already going to sound different than the competition, and you're going to be drafting off of what I read into this, the majority of positive mental associations and memory structures that many of your listeners have around this time of year. With B2B though, you could also tap into some like pain messaging, right? At the end of the year, a lot of times it's crunch time. Everybody's, half the office is gone, or we're trying to get all this stuff done. You could tie into that, like make it relevant to the season in an interesting way, so you can get out there and enjoy the holidays with your family.
Love that. Thank you so much for that, Stu. We're going to transition now into some quick honorable mentions. First, okay, I'm very excited about this as a buyer. The IAB came out with a new buyer and selling guide. Julia, my buying queen, tell me, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so the guide is a hefty 25 pages that I had the pleasure of reading through. But it is a mixture of podcast media planning and buying 101s with specific details to the nuances of podcast planning. I think this is a great reference for marketers if they want to get to know more about what we do as podcast buyers. Something I found particularly interesting was there was a big focus this year at Podcast Movement with the standardization of terminology. And although short, there is a glossary at the end of the guide, which can help us standardize some of those terms that we use, and kind of relate back to what we were trying to push forward here at Podcast Movement. All in all, I think they did a good job of putting together the explanation of the process of podcast planning. But with like anything, there's certain nuances and hurdles that arise as a buyer that cannot be summed up so succinctly in a buyer's guide. Overall, I think it's a great high level wrap up of what we do as buyers.
I think so too. Yes, also to the 25 pages. That was a hefty read. For reference though, for all of our listeners, the Oxford Road Media how-to manual is 95 pages, and our glossary is 7 pages long. And that's a real number because I wrote it, so I would know. I really liked this because it got into some of like the nuances that you don't often see in how-tos. It's not just like, here's what the term means. It was actually talking about like full overview of budgets and frequency, which is not something that we've talked a lot about as an industry, but is becoming more and more prevalent as we look into how to make DI work with programmatic on the horizon. I think for me, the one thing that I thought was like egregiously missing was more talk about reconciliation, if only because it took reconciliation and invoicing as one beast. And we like to break things out between planning, buying, reconciliation, and invoicing because each is its own set of processes. I think if you're your own one-person buying team, it makes sense to put it like this, to be as high level and transparent as possible. But just know, if you're thinking, okay, I'm a one-shop buyer, I'm in-house, this is going to help me become my best self, I'm going to go in guns blazing, and these networks aren't going to know what hit them, you will be thrown for a loop when it gets time to clear all those invoices that now don't make any sense because nothing's going to match to your buying software. That's really what I took initially from it as somebody who gets very granular with the information. Julia, did you note like any nuances to maybe like some insights that you would pull together for a client? Like, did you feel like anything was egregiously missing, or you just think it's too nuanced to even touch?
Yeah, I think they do a good job of asking, or kind of asking the question and answering it. You know, you might run into things here, and here. But I do think that, there was nothing that stood out that was missing that isn't so nuanced that might not apply every time.
Do you
I
want
love
clients to read it? Do you want clients to read it so they know what you go through?
That would be nice.
Or maybe
the
the account teams too.
Yeah. I cannot get that back to you within the hour. If you take a look at the buyer's guide, I need some time.
Yeah, and I think I just want to touch on that from like the point of view of someone who has CAOs, who work with them every day and like they're in the trenches with me. Like once they understood the full scope of the role and that everything can't be on a set timeline every time, and there are those tiny details that you get caught up on, they became much more giving with and graceful with their responses. And I think that is like a key thing that's missing. You need somebody who understands what you're going through as much as they're going through.
I think that's massive, and that's something from my background in being on. I think that's massive, and that's something from my background in being on direct response television commercials. Sometimes it's like you look if you go out on a TV set, and we just did actually a spot for one of our clients, and you see all these different people. You're like, well, what's that guy do? That person just moves that coffee cup around on that table, and well, so they do their hair. Well, okay, so they change their shirt, but it's like every job is so specialized and there's so much to it. I see this as a really good sign, even for the industry, that it's like every aspect of this really takes a specialist to understand what's going on. And there's a full lexicon and there's a full approach that's been built and continuing to be built. And just like yes, it's absolutely worth having an art department. It's absolutely worth having the hair and makeup person, the grips, the electrics, all of them, because all of them, if they're all expert, everything is going to be at the top level. And it makes a fantastic, I see this as a very good, move. I see this as a very good sign that podcast is continuing to grow up. It's excellent.
I love that anecdote. And also, I love that we're talking about TV commercials because our last honorable mention is actually a TV commercial. So Neal, what little tidbit from the internet do you want to talk about today?
Oh, so I was watching the MLB playoffs last week and up popped a Allstate commercial. So, it's podcasting has had yet another pop culture moment, and Allstate featured podcasting in its commercial. They didn't include the Mayhem character, so I'm bummed about that. But they had a character in the ad who basically is like, there's a podcast for that. There's a podcast for that. And he's like in a business meeting listening to and seemingly not paying attention and gets called out. And he's like, well, I'm listening to a podcast on multitasking. So it's a pretty funny spot. We like it. We thought it was fun. I'd love to hear Stew's POV on this.
It's awesome. Casting and the creative is perfect. And that guy, it's so worth watching. I think kind of similar point of view to the last story, actually. I take this as a really good sign, right? Because there are the headlines of the stories out there is, was podcast dying or whatever. It's like, well, what's dying is if you write in blank checks to celebrities that can't hold court behind a microphone. But this is another great sign that Allstate and all the creatives and the brand behind this view podcast as culturally relevant enough and have a massive enough force and culture that they could bank an entire piece of creative on it. That to me that's a really positive sign.
How much insurance is it going to sell?
That is a great question, and that is the ultimate question. But we are really happy here within podcasts that we made it. We made it into an Allstate commercial, and we've got a menace here. We've got a menace that can rival the Mayhem. And I'll toss it back to you, Spencer.
Yeah, I would just say that, there's a ton of insurance advertising. James, I'm not sure what you get in Australia, but we can't get away from it in the US. And I don't think there's the expectation that those individual ads are going to convert somebody, but they're creating brand preference or at least a memory structure that when you're at that point where you're considering insurance, consider Allstate, consider Geico, Progressive. I mean, they're spending so much money to just try to like be in the mindset when you're making that decision.
I always find it amazing. Back in my writing radio commercial, history, that of course, insurance advertisers are essentially wasting more than 90% of their money because people can't actually buy insurance right now. My insurance comes up in November, so now will be a good time. But otherwise, don't bother advertising to me. So I find it absolutely fascinating, and of course, that is exactly what's going on here. I have no idea who the Mayhem character is, but the good news is I don't need to. So that's a good thing.
If you knew, you would love him.
So you say, although I do think that the Gecko is a Brit, so apologies for that.
Is that the accent? I wasn't sure if it was a British accent or something else.
Yeah, it's a British accent, rather sadly. Anyway, gosh.
Outsourcing all of our jobs. This menace will now be saying adieu for all of our humble listeners. Thank you for joining the Media Roundtable. This podcast is brought to you by Oxford Road, where we want you to succeed in audio and to use influence for good. As members of the marketing community, we have the power to advance voices that don't just entertain, but edify, to build bridges across differences and preserve fair-minded discussion around the most important topics of our age. If you're a marketer looking to align your brand values with extraordinary business outcomes, reach out to our agency, Oxford Road, by visiting oxfordroad.com and subscribing to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer. We'd love to hear from you. If you have any feedback or suggestions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at info@mediaroundtable.com. Thank you to our guests and to Bianca, Kyle, Haley, and the team at Podcast One. As always, influence responsibly.
Hi, this is Chris Howard, host of Plugged In with Chris Howard, and I'm taking the Lions over the Chiefs in the Super Bowl. BetOnline has free odds and lines available online or on your mobile device. Visit BetOnline today.